In the 19th century, the British Empire faced an embarrassing problem. They were addicted to Chinese tea, and China did not need a single thing Britain had to offer. Silver was pouring out of the British economy. The trade deficit was becoming a crisis, so Britain asked a very simple question: what product could we sell to China that would reverse this flow? Their answer? Opium. They industrialized addiction. They hooked tens of millions of people on one of the most destructive drugs ever discovered. And when China tried to stop them, when China begged them to stop, Britain sent warships, burned palaces, and forced China to keep buying the poison. This is not an exaggeration. This is not anti-British propaganda. This is documented, uncontested history. This is how Britain nearly destroyed China with opium. To understand what Britain did, you first need to understand what China was. In the early 1800s, China was not a weak, crumbling empire waiting for Europeans to modernize it. That narrative is a lie designed to justify what came next. China was the largest economy on the planet. The Qing dynasty ruled over 400 million people. Their territory stretched from tropical coastlines to frozen northern borders. From the Pacific Ocean to the mountains of Central Asia, they had a bureaucracy that actually worked as a servant selected. Through rigorous examinations testing philosophy, history, and governance, European thinkers like Voltaire pointed to China's system as a model Europe should copy. They had literature, medicine, engineering, and philosophy stretching back thousands of years. And they produced goods the world could not get anywhere else. Silk so fine, it moved like liquid. A porcelain so delicate and beautiful that the English language simply calls it China. And tea, fragrant, irreplaceable tea that Britain had become completely dependent on. By the early 19th century, tea was not a luxury in Britain. It was a necessity. The Queen drank it, factory workers drank it, soldiers, servants, shopkeepers, everyone. Morning tea, afternoon tea, tea breaks. The entire rhythm of British daily life was built around a product that only China could provide. Britain needed China desperately. China did not need Britain at all. And that was the problem. When British merchants arrived at Canton, the only port where foreigners were allowed to trade, they came with wool, cotton, textiles, clocks, telescopes, and manufactured goods. They spread out their offerings, expecting to trade. Chinese merchants looked at it all and shrugged. No, thank you. We make our own textiles. Your clocks are interesting, but we do not need them. We have everything we require within our own borders. If you want our tea, our silk, our porcelain, you will pay in silver. That was the rule. Hard physical silver. No credit, no barter. And Britain had no leverage to change it. So year after year, British ships sailed east, loaded with silver coins, and came back loaded with Chinese goods. Millions of ounces of precious metal flowed out of Britain and accumulated in Chinese vaults. The trade deficit widened every single year. For an empire built on commerce, credit, and financial dominance, this was unsustainable. Britain was bleeding wealth to a nation that treated them like an afterthought. It was not just economics. It was humiliation. Britain had conquered a quarter of the globe. They had defeated Napoleon. They ruled India with an iron grip. And yet at Canton, British merchants were confined to a strip of warehouses outside the city walls, forced to deal through Chinese middlemen who set all the terms. The greatest empire in the world, treated like peddlers at a back door. Something had to change. A more honest nation might have accepted the situation. Cannot always get what you want. Sometimes the other side simply does not need you. But Britain was not built on accepting limitations. Britain was built on finding ways around them, usually at someone else's expense. And then someone realized the answer was already growing in fields across India. Poppies, delicate, beautiful poppies. And from those poppies came opium. Let me be clear about what opium does. When you consume it, opium floods your brain with warmth and euphoria. Pain disappears. Anxiety dissolves. You feel peaceful, complete, untouchable. For a few hours, every problem in your life simply does not exist. Then the effect fades, and your brain, which has now been chemically altered, starts screaming for more. Opium is one of the most addictive substances human beings have ever discovered. Once dependency sets in, withdrawal is not discomfort. It's torture, sweating, cramping, vomiting, insomnia. Psychological anguish so severe that addicts will do almost anything to make it stop. An opium addict does not need to be convinced to buy more. They need supply. The drug sells itself through the biology of addiction. Every user becomes a guaranteed customer for life. The Qing government understood this danger. They had banned recreational opium use all the way back in 1729, over a century before Britain's operation began. But Britain did not need Chinese approval. It did not need to convince anyone that opium was safe or beneficial. It just needed to get it into Chinese hands, because once people started using it, the drug would do the rest. Here's how Britain built the largest drug trafficking operation in human history. They controlled India through the East India Company, a corporation with its own army, its own government, and the power to wage war. In the Bengal and Bihar regions, the company took control of opium production. Indian farmers who might have grown food were pressured off and coerced into growing poppies instead. The opium was harvested, processed, and packed into standardized wooden chests, weighing about 140 pounds each. These chests were shipped to Calcutta and auctioned to private merchants. Now here's the clever part. Officially, the British government never sold opium to China. That would be illegal under Chinese law. It would look bad. Instead, they sold the opium to independent merchants, mostly British, who loaded it onto fast ships and smuggled it into Chinese waters. These merchants bribed Chinese officials, paid off local criminals, and distributed the drug through networks that spread deeper and deeper into the country. On paper, Britain's hands were clean. The Crown was just a producer. The smuggling was someone else's crime. In reality, Britain controlled every step of the supply chain. They manufactured the drug, they transported it to auction, profited from every sale. And they protected the smugglers with the unspoken threat of the Royal Navy. This was plausible deniability on an imperial scale. This was state-sponsored drug dealing dressed up as free trade, and the results were catastrophic. The opium poured into China and addiction spread like fire. It started in the port cities, sailors, dockworkers, traders with money and access. Then it crept inland. Merchants carried it to towns. Travelers brought it to villages. Opium dens appeared in cities across the country, dim, smoke-filled rooms where men lay on wooden benches, pipe in hand, chasing the next high. In 1800, roughly 4,000 chests of opium entered China each year. By 1838, that number was 40,000. Do the math? That is over 5 million pounds of opium flooding into China every single year, and the curve was still climbing. Addiction does not respect class or education. Rich men got hooked. Poor men got hooked. Farmers, scholars, soldiers, government officials. The drug did not discriminate. Entire villages had working-age men who could no longer function. Military units had soldiers too weak and dazed to train. Tax revenues collapsed because the workforce was incapacitated. Families fell apart as fathers spent everything on their next fix. And the silver that once flowed into China to pay for tea, and now flowed out paying for the poison that was destroying Chinese society from within. Britain's trade deficit vanished. The East India Company's opium revenue became so enormous it funded a significant portion of the colonial administration in India. Roads, armies, bureaucracies all paid for with money extracted from Chinese addiction. The Qing emperor watched his country disintegrate. He knew, if this continued, the empire itself would collapse. He needed someone to stop it. Someone incorruptible. Someone fearless. He appointed Lin Zexu. Lin Zexu was a scholar official with a reputation that bordered on legendary. Honest in a system riddled with bribery, effective in a bureaucracy often paralyzed by caution. The emperor gave him extraordinary powers and a single mission: end the opium trade. Lin arrived in Canton in March 1839. He did not waste time with half measures. He arrested Chinese dealers. He shut down opium dens. He interrogated officials suspected of taking bribes. Within weeks, he had disrupted the local distribution network. But Lin understood something crucial. He was treating symptoms. As long as foreign ships kept arriving with fresh cargo, the supply would never stop. He had to confront the source. Before resorting to force, Lin tried something remarkable. He wrote a letter to Queen Victoria. It was long, carefully reasoned, and devastating in its moral clarity. Lin asked the Queen to imagine a simple reversal. What if Chinese merchants sailed to England and began selling an addictive drug that destroyed British families? What if British workers, soldiers, and officials became incapacitated by a foreign substance? Would Britain call that free trade? Or would they call it an act of war? Lin pointed out that Britain banned opium domestically because the dangers were well known. So how could Britain justify forcing the same drug on China? If you protect your own people from this poison, why do you demand that we accept it? It was one of the clearest moral arguments ever made to an imperial power. The letter was sent through official channels. Queen Victoria never replied. Historians still debate whether she even read it. What is certain is that Britain did not change course. The profits were too large. The system was working exactly as designed. Diplomacy had failed, so Lin acted. Surrounded the foreign merchant quarter. He cut off food and water. He demanded the surrender of every chest of opium, all of it. No exceptions. After weeks of pressure, the merchants surrendered over 20,000 chests, more than 1,400 tons of opium. Lin could not sell it, that would make him complicit. He could not store it, someone would steal it. He could only destroy it. In June 1839, workers dug massive trenches on a beach near Canton, filled them with salt water and lime, and dumped the opium in. The chemical reaction broke it down into sludge that was flushed into the sea. It took 23 days. Lin made it a public spectacle. He wanted China and the world to see. His nation would not be poisoned quietly. In London, the story was told very differently. Reports arrived describing seized British property, detained British subjects, and violations of commercial freedom. There was no mention of addiction, no mention of ruined lives, no mention of a drug ban under Chinese law. Parliament debated. A young William Gladstone stood up and called it a war more unjust in its origin than any he had ever read of. He was ignored, because the people making money from opium had louder voices than the people talking about morality. In 1840, Britain declared war, not to spread civilization, not to protect the innocent, not to advance any principle worth defending. Britain went to war to force China to buy drugs. What followed was not a war in any meaningful sense. It was a massacre with naval support. Britain had steam-powered gunboats that could navigate coastal waters without wind. They had artillery that could fire explosive shells from distances Chinese cannons could not reach. They had rifles, tactics, and training refined through decades of colonial conquest. China had wooden ships and weapons designed for a different century. Chinese soldiers fought bravely. They were overwhelmed at every engagement. City after city fell. British forces sailed up the Yangtze River and parked their ships within striking distance of Nanjing. The message was clear: surrender, or we burn your heartland. In August 1842, the Qing court surrendered. The Treaty of Nanking was not a negotiation. It was a list of demands accepted at gunpoint. China would pay 21 million silver dollars. 6 million to compensate Britain for the opium Lin had destroyed. The illegal opium. The opium smuggled in violation of Chinese law. China had to pay Britain for confiscating drugs. 12 million to cover Britain's war costs. China had to reimburse Britain for the invasion. 5 ports would be forced open to British trade, ending China's ability to control foreign access. British citizens in China would be subject only to British law, Chinese law. Foreigners could commit crimes on Chinese soil and face no Chinese justice. And Hong Kong would be ceded to Britain forever. The treaty said nothing about banning opium. The trade continued and grew. 15 years later, Britain decided they wanted even more. The Second Opium War ended with British and French troops outside Beijing. They looted the old Summer Palace, masterpiece of Chinese culture, containing centuries of art, manuscripts, and treasures, and then burned it to the ground. The fire lasted 3 days. The smoke was visible for miles. It was not a military target. It was a message. Resist, and we will erase your civilization. The new treaties legalized opium completely. China was contractually required to allow the drug that was destroying its society. By the late 19th century, estimates suggest that tens of millions of Chinese were addicted. In some regions, 40% of adult men were regular users. The Qing dynasty, drained of revenue and legitimacy, collapsed in 1912. The chaos lasted until 1949. In China, this period is called the Century of Humiliation. It is not ancient history. It is living memory in national terms. It shapes how China sees sovereignty, foreign interference, and the words free trade. When Chinese officials say they will never again allow a foreign power to dictate terms, this is what they are remembering. An empire that called itself civilized, that spoke of law, liberty, and progress turned a nation into addicts to balance a ledger. And when that nation tried to defend itself, the empire called it aggression and burned it down. If you understand this story, you understand something essential about how power actually works. It rarely announces itself as exploitation. It comes dressed in principle, in commerce, in the language of mutual benefit. The words sound reasonable, the effects are not. This is not just a story about the past. It is a pattern. And patterns, if you learn to recognize them, repeat. The playbook has never really gone out of style. If this video showed you a chapter of history that your textbooks left out, share it. Leave a comment, subscribe for more, because the stories that get buried are usually the ones that matter most.